Hello and welcome. I'm Becky with Malvern Books. We're thrilled to be with you tonight for Brown in America, Community, Culture, and Code. Got a wonderful group for this reading and discussion. One of this illustrious group, Martha Ann Toll, will be our moderator. Martha is the 2020 winner of the Petrichor Prize for Finely Crafted Fiction. Her debut novel, Three Muses, is forthcoming from Regal House Publishing in 2022. Her fiction has appeared in Catapult, Slushpile Magazine, Yale's Letters Journal, and others. Martha's essays and reviews appear regularly on NPR and in the Millions, as well as in the Washington Post, The Lily, the Rumpus, Bloom, the Tin House Blog, and the Washington Independent Review of Books, among others. Her personal essay, Dianu, I'm sorry, Martha, I probably just messed that up terribly, was selected for the anthology Alone Together. Martha, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that, Becky. And before we get started, there is a question in the chat. Okay, that got answered about getting to the YouTube channel. Thank you. So thanks, Becky. Totally, that's Becky Garcia from Malvern Books. Really appreciate being here. And thanks to Joe, who's doing tech from the actual store, and a reminder that you can buy books at the store. And there's a phone number to call if you want to order books. We have 5 incredible speakers and panelists today. And because we are actually 6 in total, the way we're going to structure it is I'm going to ask questions and they're going to respond. But we're going to start with a question that each of them is going to answer. And to put it in context, I think that we've just had an election this week, and there's been a lot of critical questions that have come up during that election. And during our discussion, we're going to hone in on place, the immigrant experience. Some people on the panel are immigrants, and some folks are the children of immigrants, and some are both. We're going to talk about family taboos, and we hope to spend a fair amount of time talking about racism in America. So what I'm going to now do is call on each panelist to answer a question, and I'm going to ask a bunch of questions for a while, and then I will signal to you and ask that you put questions in the chat box so you will have an opportunity to engage directly with these amazing, amazing writers. So the opening question is, what does it mean to you as a writer to be brown in America? And I'm going to start with Donna Miscolta, whose book, Living in Color, looks like this. It's a great book, and it's a collection of short stories. So Donna, and I'm sorry, one other thing I have to do is be a bit of a timer. So we'll try to do like 1 to 2 minutes each on this question, please. Okay, hold on, Donna. We can't hear you. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Hi, I'm Donna Miscolta, and I'm the author of 3 books of fiction, and the most recent of which is Living Color, as Martha showed you, Living Color, Angie Rubio stories, which follows the progress of a young Mexican-American girl's education, focusing in particular on the lessons that she learns that are not part of any real classroom curriculum. They're actually lessons about what it's like to be a brown girl in this culture and society that favors neither her race nor gender. And so the question about what does it mean to be a brown writer in America, I think is similar to the question that I try to answer in Living Color for my protagonist, Angie Rubio. And her question is, what's it like to be a brown girl in America? And I think that the answers are pretty similar. So for I think for both me and Angie, it feels like when Angie plays with her playmates, and she is assigned the role of monster rather than princess or rescuer. Or it feels like when she's in the 4th grade and she discovers that she is in what's considered the dumb class. Or it feels like when she brings a news article for current events about Sam Cooke, and the teacher stops her and says, we we're not concerned about news about celebrities. So she never has a chance to talk about how Sam Cooke and his band were not allowed in a hotel in Louisiana because it was for whites only. And it seems like when she's in high school and she wants to write for the school newspaper, but it's been commandeered by the popular white kids. So that's sort of what it seems to me to be a writer, a brown writer in America, when someone whose stories are often sidelined because they're not considered as important or interesting enough in an industry where the gatekeepers and the decision makers are 85% white.
Thank you so much. And we will come back to all of these topics. Sejal, can I ask you the same question? I am having trouble. There, I just unmuted you. This is Sejal's book, which is a marvelous collection of essays called "This Is One Way to Dance."
Thank you so much, Martha. Thanks, everyone. I think I just wrote some notes. I've been thinking about this, but as a brown writer in America, knowing that your life and your history has traditionally not been represented in, I think, certainly what I grew up reading for well over half my life, and to choose what stories that we want to add to what's out there now. I think to make a space for a color and experience that's often elided, omitted, or overlooked. And I think particularly in a country and culture that's struggling with acknowledging systemic racism towards Black Americans and the insidiousness of white supremacy, brown just gets, I think, lost.
Thank you. Grace, I'm gonna hold up Grace's beautiful book. It's a memoir, The Body Papers, and just unmuting you, Grace. Please go ahead.
So there's positives and negatives to it, but I think I'll focus on the kind of the ways that I guess I've been felt uncomfortable, or the ways I've noticed what was hard about it. And it's that, first of all, I didn't even ever think that me as a subject or somebody that looked like my family would be worthy of a book. Like I read so many books, and like I hadn't ever read any with people of color in it, with Filipinos, with, it was mostly a diet of stories about white people. And so like my imagination was curtailed. I didn't even think that like I was worthy of that. So it took me a really long time to turn to myself and to turn to people that looked like me and my family, and to have that kind of connect and think that I could write about it. But I guess to be a brown writer oftentimes is to feel like an afterthought, invisible, secondary. But I also have to pretend that I don't see it. If I want to be gracious and if I want to fit into spaces, I have to pretend like, oh, I didn't hear that or see that, or, I don't notice that I'm the only, brown person in this room. So there's things like that. That's a constant negotiation that feels really complicated and painful at times. But on the plus side, there's affinities, like there's people that I can connect with and find. And I value those relationships so much because, I don't know, maybe it's because we both have similar negative experiences, but I also do value my community of writers of color.
Thank you very much, Grace. And each of you is raising questions that I sure will return to. Jenny has written a collection of short stories called Each of Us is Killers. And I'm going to turn this over to Jenny. It sounds like you're unmuted, Jenny, I think.
Yes, can you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you, Martha. And, I just listening to Sejal and Grace and Donna, I echo pretty much everything they've said. And I would add for me that being a brown writer in America means, excuse me, having a sort of vague and ambiguous identity, because, you know, you're not white, you're not black. And so just like being a brown person in America, it means getting mistaken for Asian, Middle Eastern, Latinx, you know, and it means being overlooked often in discussions about race issues. Also, being the shade of brown that I am, South Asian, I feel that often we are overlooked as writers with something important to say, unless, of course, it happens to be about slums or arranged marriage or terrorism. And so, you know, we hear about the danger of the single story that Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie has said, and I feel that, you know, we get pigeonholed to some extent into a certain box and labeled so that it's easy for somebody to say, okay, that's, yeah, I got it, that's who this writer is, when I want to say, well, that's not the only thing I write about. Because, okay, so with my collection, the first 2 stories deal with racism in America, and both of those stories also deal with intersectional issues such as class and caste, because I don't know how, as a South Asian writer and part of a South Asian community, how I can just write about one kind of issue. For me, feminism has to come into that, casteism comes into that, even in the US, and classism comes into that. So it's not just about race, there's all the intersectional issues. And so I do believe that sometimes things get, you know, overlooked or simplified. And it's not as easy as that. It's not just Hindu versus Muslim. It's not just about the color of my skin. There's all these other intersectional forces as well.
Thank you so much. And Sopan's book is a memoir called Missed Translations, which in many ways is emblematic of this entire panel, I think. Please go ahead, Sopan.
Thank you. Thanks to everybody for being here, and thank you to all of our panelists. You know, it's interesting. I don't try to think much about being a brown writer, and not because I shy away from it, because I like to just think of myself as a writer first and foremost. And oftentimes when you're viewed as a brown writer, it feels like the publishing world and newspaper editors, et cetera, they only will let you write about brown issues. And I think that's a very, you know, that's one of the tough things I think about being a person of color, is that, you know, there's this question about who can write about what. But, you know, I think being brown in America, you know, it means something different for all of us. And for me, I'm shaped by growing up in middle-class New Jersey, you know, to divorced parents who had a really difficult marriage. And, you know, I had certainly had a different experience than, you know, a lot of the women I grew up with that are also Bengali. And so it means something different for all of us. But for me, you know, I'm proud of, you know, I have a complicated relationship with the community, but I'm proud of the community with which I came from. And I think that I try to make that clear in my writing, but it also doesn't encompass everything of who I am. I also have other things to say about things that have nothing to do with being brown. So that's essentially where I come down on that.
Thank you. Before we go to our next question, Donna, there's a question in the chat about what age group your book targets.
Yeah, that's a good question. When I was writing it, I was writing it just as stories, but I did get some readers identified it as young adult, and others didn't. And it's not targeted to young adults, but I think it is appropriate for young readers. And I think it's appropriate for readers of any age. I guess when my publisher decided to publish it, there was never any question that it was not an adult, you know, for an adult audience. But I do think it's something that really crosses genres. So I would encourage anybody to read it. And I think I mean, I think it's a good book for schools.
Mhm. I would have to agree. I think young people would really resonate with it, but also, I mean, I did as well. I totally agree. So Sopan and Sejal just have both touched on this. You two were born in America, raised in America, but America doesn't always want to see you as an American. And Sopan, I think it's super interesting what you said about wanting to write about topics that are of interest to you and not necessarily typecasting for whatever somebody wants you to be. So, and you also, Sejal and Sopan also have Rochester in their background. Sejal is from Rochester and lives there now. And Sopan, I think your dad emigrated to Rochester, if I'm correct about that. So I want to ask you each if you would talk a little bit about your first trip to India and also that experience of being, born and bred here, as I think a couple of other panelists maybe as well, but there was so much resonance between your two books. I thought it would be interesting for you to each chat about that a little bit.
Sure.
Sopan, do you want to start?
Actually, Sejal, why don't you go first?
Okay. And Sejal, I know you had something you wanted to read, and I'm not sure if this is the time you want to read it, but.
Oh, maybe I just will because I'm afraid I'll forget.
Okay.
Zoom. I was just, this is from Grace's book. Your author's note I thought was so lovely. There was just this question of, my story is not only my story, and that this lies about things being omitted, but I didn't write this book for them. I wrote it for me and for you, the living, and those who come after me. I loved that for the audience, and it reminded me, someone had just quoted back to me that I quoted the poet Aga Shahid Ali. I titled an essay in my book after the last lines of his poem Stationary, "The world is full of paper, write to me." And in my postscript for that, "The world is full of paper, I am writing now. I am writing to myself and others like me."
Beautiful, thank you.
Which is not answering the question about.
No, that's okay. It's beautiful. It was totally on point. I was asking the fact that America doesn't always want to see you as the American girl that you are, born and bred in America.
I found that first trip to India, I was 19. I found it very disorienting. I went with my mother and my brother. My brother was born there, but grew up here. And my mother had lived in India, but isn't from there. So it was a place that was, I think my overwhelming feeling of being there was thinking, oh, I'm American. I really am American. I don't know. I'm here as a tourist. And so it was difficult to come back and kind of, at that age, I think, try to make sense of what did that mean about how I had been raised and what I had been told. And,
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I found it I found it very uncomfortable to be, particularly in Gujarat. It was easier for me, I think, in other parts of India where it wasn't my home state.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Sopan?
I had a very odd first experience in India. So for those of you who don't know, my book is about a year in which I tracked down my parents who had been estranged from for several years. And when I was 18, my dad moved to India without telling anybody. He just left. So I didn't see him for about 12 years. So when I got off the plane in India, in Kolkata, where I didn't even know he was living until just before that, I had not seen him in 12 years. And the last time I saw him when I was 18, my father was kind of this kind of broken down man. He felt very defeated by America. He looked haggard. He didn't look well. He was unhealthy. So when I got off the plane in Kolkata, I thought I was going to see a version of that 12 years, except 12 years worse. Instead, what happened was I got off the flight and I see this toned, tanned man who is well-dressed and he's got muscles and he's got more hair than I do. And he just looks incredible. And he's striding towards me with so much confidence. I'm like, where have you been my whole life? And that set the tone for this trip. It was essentially a 3 weeks in India with this stranger who I knew very little about. And so to Sejal's point, I definitely felt like a tourist, but I felt like even more of a 10 times the tourist with my father, who I didn't even recognize him. Like I couldn't believe my eyes. And so it was less about the location and more about the person, which defined that trip for me. But, it was still an interesting tip. It was just a very odd experience. I think I need to go back and experience it in a way that wouldn't shock me the first time around.
And we don't hear about that, but there are actually a lot of immigrant stories of people who have come here, and America is so unforgiving that they decide to return to wherever it was that they were coming from. Of course, that's not possible for refugees. But anyway, it's a really interesting story about your dad. Grace, you actually lived in the Philippines as an adult, and I think you have memories of living in the Philippines as a child, and then coming here. I have a feeling you probably have some comments on this.
What Sejal said about feeling so American and that certainty, I felt that too. Like I was so looking forward to going to the Philippines and going home, because my parents always refer to the Philippines as home, even though we hadn't been there in 20 years. And so I just had this idea like, oh, my home. And I get there and like, no, I am American. I tried, like when I was living in the Philippines for 6 months, I thought like, I'm gonna put everything I can on. I'm gonna get my hair done there. I'm gonna buy clothes there. I'm gonna like blend in and blend into the crowd. And it just wasn't possible. People spotted me like this. I don't know what it was. I did ask people. They said it was that Americans smell different. I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about. They did. They insisted. Like, but I'm eating the same food as you. I'm washing my clothes, and I didn't understand what they meant, but they said we smell different. That's why.
Oh, Grace, that was my fantasy. I just have to say, like, yeah, that I would go to India and then, like, I could, blend in. Absolutely.
Wow. And Jenny, how about your experience of, excuse me, I'm having trouble unmuting you. Can you unmute yourself?
Sorry. Yes. Sorry.
Yeah. Your experience of definitely living within both cultures, and you are also a translator. And I think you might have something to say here.
Well, yeah. So for me, I was born and raised in India. I left the country at age 18. I went to the UK and then Europe before I came to the US. So I'd already done a bit of kind of nomadic moving around. So for me, obviously it wasn't the same going back to India as it was for Sejal and Sopan. That said, what Grace said just struck rung a bell there for me, because when after having been in the US for such a long time, more than 20 odd years, and then in mid 2014, I went back to India to work on these book projects, the translation and stuff, and I ended up staying for 6 years. But even though I went back and I felt like I had completely gone back into the flow and I could speak the language and I was doing well, people said to me, oh, they knew right away that I was not, that I'd come from, I was an NRI. They call it NRI, non-resident Indian. It's a way of saying you're from the US or whatever. And they said they could tell. And in my case, when I asked them why, they said it's just the way you carry yourself now. It's the facial expressions. The way you carry yourself is very different from how an Indian-born woman, no matter how emancipated she might be, how she carries herself in public versus how you carry yourself. So that was an interesting thing for me. But come to your question about, being that immigrant, not having been born in the US, what I found most interesting was how people a lot of times assumed that I wouldn't get many of the cultural, things in the US. Whereas, people forget that, India's had cable television and even movies and everything since the 90s, right? Since liberalization began. Before I left India, I was watching Beverly Hills 90210 over there. I was, I was watching all the shows and Seinfeld and, whatever else, Friends and everything. So I did get the cultural references. There are some I don't get that are, maybe from much, maybe back in the 70s and 80s, because I didn't grow up, I didn't go to school here. But that would be the same for even somebody from the UK who would have come here, and they would not have got some of those references, right? But I find that, it's very interesting how people just have this assumption that you won't know. I grew up reading Nancy Drew and that sort of stuff. So Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew and a lot of other American cultural markers there that we had in India as well. So again, because middle class life and everything, so you did have access to those things. So I think coming here as an immigrant, that took me by surprise initially. And then I was here when 9/11 happened, and that was another turning point for me as a brown person. I was living in Southwest Michigan at the time, in Kalamazoo. I was working and living there. And I remember how it was almost as if a switch had flipped, because suddenly people were asking me even more than usual, where I was from, because I obviously didn't look, American or white. And I would get asked, where are you from? Are you from Pakistan? And I'd be like, no. And then I felt, and I feel bad about this now, but I felt like I had to preemptively let people know I'm from India and I'm not Muslim. I would sometimes work that into the conversation just so that, people didn't look at me in this weird sort of standoffish way. If there was some workplace get together or I was with my boyfriend's family or whatever, So yeah, it wasn't explicit oppression or microaggression. And it was probably, some of it was in my head or whatever, but I felt like I had to explain myself or my brownness more than I had done before. So yeah.
Thank you. I want to sort of jumping off from all of these comments. A lot of you have, possibly all of you have written about, used your writing to breach certain cultural taboos, not just from the culture, well, you're sort of all bicultural, but cultures that you came from, but just taboos in general. And we had an interesting conversation in preparing for this panel about maybe that's what writers do, maybe that's part of our job. Grace, I wanted to, if I could start with you. Your memoir is complicated and it's a beautiful story about your own growing up experience. And it's also about the abuse that you suffered, the sexual abuse that you suffered from your grandfather. And I wondered if you would talk to us a little bit about that and how it affected your, sort of how it led you to writing, or how this and writing connected, and what it meant for you to be able to write about what's a taboo on many levels.
Yeah, I mean, that is definitely a really big taboo to write about what happened or what he did. And I mean, even when I'd sort of tested the waters with my family, like my extended family, not my nuclear family, but I'd written a piece in the book about my father receiving a punishment from my grandmother. So the one my grandfather, his wife. So they're particularly violent, and so that got published on the internet, and my extended family reacted right away, and it was very negative. And that was a moment where I had to think about, like, this is the reaction. So what does it mean for me to go further? They didn't like that I wrote that. I mean, if I write chapters or a book about what my grandfather did for 7 years, to me, that's, they're going to have an even bigger reaction. And so it took some more years after that for me to publish my book, but I really needed to do some personal growth about it, and to realize, like, well, that's what I'm going to give up then. That's okay. Like, I'm not going to be loyal to that narrative anymore. And even if I lose everybody, I guess I'm just going to have to lose them, because I'm more loyal to the truth, but I'm also feel more protective to my nieces and nephews, and the people, like what Sejal said, it was like the people who come after me. I don't want to lie to them and they're going to get hurt. Like, people lied to me. Actually, people did know about what my grandfather was like, and nobody told my parents or me. So that's in terms of the dangers of a story, that was the danger of a story that people didn't tell. And, me and a lot of other people have paid with our lives. It's just, horrible.
It's an incredible act of courage to get that on paper, and your book is amazing. Sopan, I feel like you were also breaching taboos by, sharing your sense of, this is my words, not yours, but being abandoned by your parents, or, you've mentioned that you were out of touch with your dad for 12 years. And certainly that's, well, I think you had to work with your parents, I guess, to be able to write what you wanted to write.
Yeah, the taboos, I think it's common among immigrant families that we don't talk much in the house. We don't talk about emotions or mental health, and we don't discuss our emotions in any meaningful way. I think when my parents got married, it was more of a business arrangement, right? It was arranged. They didn't know each other. They didn't they didn't understand each other as people, which then carried over to their children, where they didn't understand them as people and vice versa. So it was taboo to write about it because it's not common. It was very uncomfortable for my parents to see these, thoughts in a book, on pages, in print. But I thought there was an important message behind what I was trying to get across in the book, about empathy, about, certain things, certain barriers that exists for, the generation before us. But I will say the biggest takeaway I had in this journey of getting to know my parents was just, I grew up in middle-class New Jersey, and, I had certain privileges, like being able to go to a college and pursue a career of my choice. And, if I want to date someone down the hall, I could go, ask them on a date or whatever. And my parents view choice and freedom as something completely different. My parents, something I always say is that, my parents, they came here to survive. Like that's what the generation before us came here to do. Whereas I had the freedom to kind of live, and so that was kind of my big takeaway from the whole experience.
Thank you. Sejal, do you want to comment on that? Sejal, I am having trouble unmuting you, so hang on a second. There you go. Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say, Sopan, I thought I'd maybe share the story of how we first.
Oh, wow.
Our books were paired. Actually, I guess you didn't know this right away, but my book was on a most anticipated list, but it had his cover. I didn't know who this was, but I was like, well, it's either that book or my book, but I guess it was my book, that particular list. But anyway, I was so glad when I read about Sopan's book, because I think particularly writing about mental health is, and writing honestly about that and family dynamics is difficult in, I think, South Asian families. I know for my mom was not very happy with my book. And I don't know if my dad has read the whole thing. And I don't think that my in-laws have read it. No, I'm sure that they have not. So I think I felt like it was really hard to write honestly about gender and sexuality and mental health and mental illness and failure, and also class. And actually, although I wrote about those things, I also really became aware of silences, the things that I hadn't written about. And so on the one hand, I will get emails or this response, I feel like I really know you, or, that you've shared so much of yourself. And I think, even though I'm sure my family may have preferred that I told different stories, there were lots of things, because I started these essays 20 years ago when I was in graduate school and was being harassed by one of my professors. I mean, that's not in there at all. And that was a huge part of my life in becoming a writer and surviving academia. That's not in there, for example.
If I can piggyback, part of the issue here is because there's such little, quote unquote, brown representation in TV, film, literature, media, whatever, there's a sort of pressure that whenever we do something, whether it's a memoir, whether it's, you saw like in Mindy Kaling's Never Have I Ever, that everything has to project the very, very best of our culture. Meanwhile, there are serious issues, that are there to be examined, because there's such little, so little of our stories are allowed to be told in the West, that there's this pressure to not kind of hold sunlight to those issues. I remember, reading the reviews to, Never Ever Ever, and there's some people, well, that's not my story. Well, I can't relate to that. Well, you're not going to relate to that. But that same expectation is not thrust upon white writers. Like you don't hear, for example, someone watching, and I'm just using this as an example, like Keeping Up with the Kardashians saying, well, now I know everything about America. That's not how the discussion goes, but when there's very little diversity, that's how discussion goes for, people of color.
Right. No, that's such an important point. Thank you. So I'm going to guess that we have a lot of questions from our audience. So if you folks would start to just type them in the chat box, I'm going to ask one question of all 5 of you. And it's a general question about racism and being both invisible and in some ways too visible. And you've all touched on, I'll touch on a bit. I wish that I could read everything out loud, everything you've written, but I want to read 2 quotes. The first is from Grace, who ended up kind of just losing a friendship with a girlfriend in, I think it was high school or college. And she wasn't a bad person, but she just couldn't understand her own racism, I guess I would say. This is a quote. This is not about bad people. This is about a system of white supremacy that decent people, unaware of their power and privilege, enact and uphold. And I think that's something that this country is so very, very, very clearly grappling with, or not grappling with, might be a better way to put it. And I'm now quoting from Sejal's book, her reaction to what it means to have a, quote, exotic name. This is what white boys say. Your hair, your skin. This is what black boys say. We together. This is what Asian boys say. You date out too, I can tell. This is what the Jamaican boys say. I never liked you Indians. This is what the Desi's say. Get out of Massachusetts, move to New York. And this is a sort of a tragic encapsulation of where we are as a country and society. So if I could ask each of you to kind of speak about both the invisibility and visibility of racism, and also reading with intentionality, what books brought you to where you are and what books do you suggest? And this is a great time to remind everybody that the Malvern bookstore is open. And if you want to buy a book now, you can dial 512-322-2097. Joe's at the store, or go on the website and purchase any of these books or any of the books that you're about to hear about. So Donna, could you start? And then I'm going to go to Jenny next. Thank you. Okay, Donna, can you unmute yourself? So wait a minute, yeah, thank you.
Okay, it sounded like that was a 2-part question about.
Yeah, so it's both the invisibility and visibility of racism, and also what books, brought you to, guided you in your writing life.
Okay.
Thank you, yeah, okay. Yeah, we're just hoping this is Donna's book.
Well, identity and color and race, it's inescapable in my books, because the characters in my book exist as brown people. So even if I show them just going to the store or going bowling or eating dinner, they're doing so in the context of a white-centered space, and with certain perspective, whether that's apparent or not. And so it doesn't mean that identity and race and its companion racism is present in every scene or every action in my book. In fact, that's hardly the case. But I think that at some level, as a brown person who has accumulated experience in a white-dominated space, I think that it's hard not to think that my characters would not be endowed with some level of that consciousness. And so I'm interested in how my characters, what their experience is as those two worlds bump up against each other, and as they're trying to locate themselves in a space where they belong, some place where they can claim. So I think all of my books have that element of belonging and claiming space. For instance, in Angie Rubio, in each of the stories, she is doing something that is sort of her, her daily part of her daily existence, and doing these actions that seem innocuous, but at the heart, they're lessons to her in racism, and also how to grow this awareness of herself as a brown person in this space. And in terms of, I think the second question is about writers who have guided us. And I had a list that I gave you, and they were like, I just wanted to mention two in particular, because I had a list of fiction and nonfiction, and I wanted to point out Luis Urrea's book, The House of Broken Angels, because one of the things that I remember was Viet Nguyen's New York Times review of that book. And I had something, the quote, he said it was a powerful rendering of a Mexican-American family that is also an American family. And he added, and what is Urrea's novel but a Mexican-American novel that is also an American novel? And so this was significant to me because it's a question I think I would like to ask of all of our works. Why can't each of us have our books considered an American novel or an American memoir? Mm-hmm. And the other book that I wanted to mention that wasn't on the list that I gave you, it's called Trace, Memory, History, Race, and the American Landscape, yeah, by Laurette Savoy. Yeah. She weaves a personal account of her family's history into a historical and geological, she's a geologist, a geological look at how the concept of race has marked the land and the society that we live in. And it's a remarkable book to me, and I highly recommend it.
Yeah, I agree with you. I can't recommend that highly enough. And we did talk about, Sejal put a note in the chat box that reviews matter. And we talked amongst ourselves about the difficulty of getting white reviewers to review non-white writers. It's a huge, huge issue, and it's ongoing. And if there are any reviewers on the screen here, I hope that you will make some efforts to lift up other voices. Jenny, I know I'd asked you to go next, and there is a question in the chat for you. What challenges did you face as a brown writer? Any benefits of being a brown writer in a US market or in a global market?
Yeah, great question. And it sort of ties into what you've asked as the first question, which is how does racism or the invisibility aspect play into my writing? And I would say that I echo what Donna said, which is that the stories that are set in the US, and there's a number of them that are set in the US, not all of them are in India, certainly the point of view of the character, because the character is brown, they are moving through the world as a minority, as a brown person, and dealing with certain issues, microaggressions. So of course, the stories, I can't imagine how I could even write a story with a brown character that doesn't deal with how they are being treated by the world and how they are then responding to that. So as I mentioned again, both the first two opening stories right there are about two characters, a man and a woman, two brown people in the US dealing with racism. But at the same time, they're also dealing with gender issues and classism and casteism because they happen to be South Asian. So again, as I've said before, when I, as a South Asian, shade of brown, I can't imagine how I could possibly even write because of South Asian culture being what it is, how I can write any work of fiction where I have a brown character and only focus on the racism aspect or the race aspect, because I have to bring in these other intersectional aspects as well because of our culture being what it is. So that's one thing. And so coming to, I'll get to the reading list in a bit. I'll answer the question, which is the challenges or benefits of being a brown writer in the US. I think the challenge is what I said at the beginning, which is because you're not white and you're not black, it's almost as if what you have to say, what I have to say as a South Asian writer isn't seen as quite as important. I felt that when I was querying for my book and I was saying, these are the issues I'm writing about, there's caste and class and gender. And I just felt like, okay, well, is it about slums? Is it about arranged marriage? Is it about terrorism? Well, no, it's not about any of those things. I'm sorry. But well, then, yeah, because that's the fiction that sells for South Asian writing. That's the fiction they want from you. The rest of it isn't as important. And so you have that danger of the single story, if you like, right? So that's the biggest challenge I see in the US for a South Asian writer writing fiction. Mm-hmm. I would say that in the global, as you know, I think the question is more because I've got a book that's also been published in India. And that's there's a whole other issue there, because there's networking and cronyism and cliques, and the publishing industry there is just really small. English publishing, I should say. English publishing is very small, very incestuous. People just keep moving around the same publishing houses there. And unless you grew up in a certain milieu and knew the Delhi publishing world, Delhi publishing is like New York publishing. And, you know, so it's hard to crack. It's hard to get into. Now, if you've got a book that's done well in the US as a South Asian writer, like Sopan's book, they love that. But if Sopan had tried to first publish in the US, in India, I think it would have been a very different game for him. So I think that, you know, India has certain other issues, challenges, and I've seen both sides of it because of my two books. Coming to your last question real quick is, you know, which writers have informed my work? And then which writers have I learned from in terms of racism? For me, these are two slightly different questions, and I'm not going to make it a very long list, because I'll say that in terms of which writers have informed my work, it has been South Asian writers like Rohinton Mistry, who wrote about all of these issues. And he's also an immigrant Canadian. He left India and went to Canada. So writers like Rohinton Mistry, writers like Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who born and raised in another country, came to the US, and then she's written about, you know, her culture and her community. When it comes to learning about racism, my big ahas came from writers like Toni Morrison, Octavia Butler. I'm not a sci-fi writer, but oh my God, in the early 2000s, I took a writing workshop at Iowa, and we had to read Parable of the Sower and a couple of other Octavia Butler books. And that it was like the flipping of a switch, just opened my eyes and gave me language with which to be able to speak about the things I couldn't put words to. So
these are all incredibly fabulous reading suggestions. And I read something about Octavia Butler that kind of blew my mind. I mean, she's so extraordinary, and she is, you know, this is again a problem of classification. She is classified as a science fiction writer, which I sort of hate because it's too narrow in my opinion. But she does talk about it in terms of the Black experience is the ultimate science fiction horror story, where you are kidnapped from one planet and taken to a completely alien place, never to return. And it is actually an incredible metaphor. Science fiction is an extraordinary metaphor for the Black experience. There are wonderful reading suggestions in the chat box, everybody. Grace, please go ahead and thank you.
Yeah, so I like posted my list too soon. I pressed the button, but some of these, you know, I have some of the same favorite writers as other folks. And when I thought about like the period right after that, the period where I first knew that were other writers besides like all the white writers I was reading, these were the first writers who I came across. And so, you know, that mean a lot to me still. yeah, and Toni Morrison is there, and I'll probably like, I look at like YouTube videos of interviews with her and James Baldwin, and feel like more sure of what I'm doing and why, and I'll feel motivated when I look at those. So these are some of the important people from early on, and then these lists have lists of other Asian American and Filipino American writers and books that I've really enjoyed. And of course, I think it's important to support our host tonight, the wonderful Malvern Books. And so that's my plug there. So you're asking about invisibility and visibility.
Or the twin sides of racism.
Yeah. I think for the longest time, I wanted to talk myself out of it. And that was like that racism existed. I mean, that was the rhetoric that I was taught anyways in school, was there are no color lines. And they didn't say race is a construct, but they said, you could be purple and that would be fine. But so that really kind of messed with me, because I wanted to believe it too. It's like, yeah, like that sounds really good. Like, I don't want to be discriminated against. I don't want people to treat me differently. But then there were limitations that were very painful to come against, like dating. I mean, it's not like I was in high school. I'm not going to have kids with these people, but like miscegenation, that was the fear. And so we came up against these limits that, in a painful way, at least early on, I realized, no, there is a difference. Like people are mad about affirmative action. They think I'm going to go to college and take their spot over them. And they're telling me this like in class. So, I mean, those are, racial microaggressions and stuff, but it was shocking for me because I had grown up believing this idea that like, it doesn't matter. And you're accepted, and you could be any color and we like you anyways. And that wasn't true. And my husband is African-American. He's from the South. And like, he talks to me about, he's more clear about that his whole life. He's been very clear about that. He always knew like he wouldn't be invited into white people's homes, even if he's friends with their kids, and he wouldn't be invited to their weddings. Like he was really surprised when we got invited to weddings with, white people invited him to, because he just knew that there was a line there. So I grew up thinking there wasn't a line.
And I think that is somewhat generational. And I think even if it was well intended, my parents certainly told me the same thing, that, we need to be colorblind, but even if it was well intended, it's definitely an erasure and a problem. And yeah. Sejal, I want to come back to you, and there is a question that I think is to you. Well, let me raise this question. I think we'll have other commenters on it, but while you're answering, Sejal, it's a question that says, I'm curious to hear the writer speak to how the experience of growing up brown is intertwined with growing up as an immigrant, part of an immigrant family. What part of the experience is shared with other immigrants, and what's unique? So that's a mouthful, and it's a super interesting question. So Sejal, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, that is a really interesting question. I think in the process of publishing my first book, This Is One Way to Dance, I realized how much this was about my family and my life and my experience of a particular family, and not any Indian family. As I got asked about things, or even just thought about my own, the community I grew up in, that my parents were kind of known for being serious and religious and readers. They weren't the ones who were going camping, or they didn't play cards. I don't know, what is it that they played bridge? I don't know. Some of our family friends, my dad doesn't, even before he was going through chemo, was not going to and before the pandemic, was not going to the McDonald's senior citizen thing for coffee. He would rather be home reading. And, I think I wrote a book as someone who would also, grew up would rather be home reading. So I think I started to really see how much of it was specific, and that I didn't feel comfortable generalizing for, remember after my book came out, I was asked about my experience in high school in a way that I talked to the other Indian kids I grew up with, and I said, did we ever even talk about it? I don't know what your experience was like. And they said, no, we never talked about it, because, either we developmentally maybe weren't didn't have the words for it, or those were the people that we didn't have to talk about it. So yeah, I keep thinking about, well, yeah, as a white writer going to get asked that.
Right.
Someone who is from somewhere else, but maybe that's not visible.
Right, right. Again, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. Other folks on the panel, would you like to speak to that question about how the immigrant experience ties into this? I'm going to read the question once more. I'm curious to hear the writers speak to how the experience of growing up brown is intertwined with growing up as an immigrant, part of an immigrant family. What part of the experience is shared with other immigrants and what is unique? Anybody want to speak to that? Grace?
Yes, I mean, I think the thing about being in this country, though, is, perceptions about race is like the dominant factor, right? So, because you can have immigrants who are white, and I, encountered them, and there's just it was awful. I mean, it was like a pride. Like people felt like so warm to these immigrants in Europe, and there was this pride, like, oh, here's my Italian immigrant cousin or whatever, and it was just, I don't know, it felt really different. And it took me a long time to figure it out. My friends wanted to identify with their like Irish and Italian and British and whatever roots, and it took me a while to realize, oh, it's about whiteness. That's what that's about. But I think there are like general experiences with being an immigrant, and learning the new cultural norms and things like that. Maybe feeling some precarity, that kind of feeling like a little bit the ground is moving beneath you as you're trying to figure things out. I think that whatever race you are, that probably is similar.
And I always, when I'm having these discussions, I always want to remind ourselves, I think you guys know it as well as anybody can know it, that whiteness is an invented concept, and it was invented to justify slavery. And I someday wish that would be part of our elementary school curriculum here in the United States, but it isn't yet. So I see that we're coming up on the hour, and I think we've had a really, really rich conversation. And I would love to do just one more round and ask each of you to comment sort of on what you've heard and what you want to leave our super great audience with. Sopan, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Well, I want to thank everybody for coming, and to the other panelists once again for, I just learned so much from listening to everybody. I think, I hope that everyone has, taken away a new insight from listening to us. I hope I didn't make myself sound like an idiot. That's kind of my baseline for survival after these panels. But I'm also happy to take questions, or if anyone, I'm pretty easy to get a hold of on Twitter. My email address is in my bio. Please feel free to reach out. And I think, if you're out there and and maybe you haven't read a book yet, but you have a book idea or whatever, please don't hesitate to reach out, because, as someone who went through the process, there's a lot that I wish that I knew beforehand that I know now that I always love to pass on to other people. But if you have an idea, please pursue it, because no one else is going to hand it to you. There aren't opportunities that are going to fall in your lap. You should, if you have an idea, go pursue it. If you have a novel idea, write the novel. If you have a memoir idea, write the proposal. And ultimately, there's no way for you to go forward, with those ideas unless you actually execute them. So anyway, feel free to reach out, and thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Donna? Hold on, you are still on mute. Yeah.
I just like to say that I'm really happy to have participated in the discussion, and to have. I mean, one of the things that I feel is that I feel connected to everything that my co-panelists have said, because I can identify with a lot of those issues. And I think also what this discussion has shown is that even though you may have people who are of similar backgrounds, we are still very different. We still bring unique experiences to our work. And I think that's one of the important things I would like people to remember when we're talking about writers of color, and that they're, we're not this monolithic block, that they're, and I think that's one of the things that is my concern about the publishing world, is that when they feel that they have enough stories by brown people, or they have enough stories about South Asian writers, or Filipino writers, and it's the whole thing about the single story, and I hope that's something that was emphasized in this discussion, that we have a lot of things in common, but we have a lot of things that are different in our experiences. So so thank you all for coming and listening.
Shout out to independent presses who have given many of us here a boost, which is great. Sejal? A wrap-up comment?
I was thinking about Sister Outsider, Audre Lorde, the transformation of silence into language and action, and just for all that I said, just about how important it is, I think, to write the truth, write your truth in whatever form, and in terms of breaking genres. I'm just here, Bad Indians, Deborah Miranda, Tribal Memoir, Migritude, Shailja Patel, that there are, I would never have, I wrote this essay that's not in the book about mental health. I never intended to show it to my parents. And then when they read it, they said, well, why didn't you put this in the book? This is really good. Like, you should write more about this. And I showed it to them because I was so angry that I felt like they weren't getting something. And I was thinking, it's really difficult with publishing, but I think people, to not underestimate ourselves, what Sopan is saying. I mean, write the thing that you want to write, and you don't know where it'll go. And I'm so grateful that people have done that. That we have some examples of really genre-breaking books that have done that and that can show us the way. And we need more.
Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this has been such a great conversation. I'm glad we had it. I feel like it's the beginning, as we said in our separate, conversation as a group. It's the beginning of hopefully many such conversations, because there are many layers that we can pull back. And the one thing that I would just like to say to folks who are here is the biggest takeaway that I would like to say, and it's the reason why I started the Desi Books podcast, which deals with all of South Asian literature, is to look, as Donna said, that we all have different experiences. We may be brown, but we have different experiences, different stories. South Asian literature isn't just about slums, terrorism, arranged marriage, and Bollywood. There are a lot of other stories, and there's a lot of complexity. It's not just about religion. It's not just about Hindu versus Muslim. There's casteism, there's class, there's patriarchy. So, open your mind maybe as you're reading to more of those complexities, because they exist. And unless we write about them and read about them and have conversations like these, we're not going to be able to deal with them.
Thank you. Grace?
A couple of things. Like, one is I appreciate everyone's generosity, and this reminds me how much writing is a community, and it's a community you participate in, and this was really wonderful to feel like I could say what I wanted to say and feel like I belong in a way here. So I appreciate that. And I was thinking about what we can all do, like all the small acts that we might do to amplify people's voices. Write, besides if you're the writer, of course, writing the thing that you want to write, but also buying the books and like going to the libraries and supporting the events and things of the people that you want to hear from more, if you're tired of like the same old stories and tropes and things, like there are plenty of talented writers writing about all kinds of incredible things, and many people are trying to, like, they don't make money off of it. They've already figured out a way not to make money off of it because they know that they probably can't. And so, but they still need to keep going, and maybe that's through amplifying, leaving reviews for them in places, or just reading it and sending them a note or something. But like our economy has shifted to this attention economy, and that's quite valuable. So even reading somebody's stuff online is really an act of generosity. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all of our panels. You're so generous with your time and especially and your thoughts, and particularly your books. And I would encourage all of us to read as widely and deeply as we can. It's a beautiful way to create space and peace, and also learn about what's going on right around us. Huge shout out to Malvern Books and Becky Garcia. Thank you so much for hosting us. It was a beautiful conversation.
Thank you so much. And on behalf of Joe Bratcher, the owner of Malvern, and myself, we're so happy to be able to host this. We've found Joe has really always had an interest in books of translation. So we have a very large part of our collection is works in translation. And we feel like that's it's an interesting way to bring other communities and other cultures into our reading sphere. And so many wonderful writers are overlooked that haven't been published here before. They just have like one book in English and people didn't even know about them. And so that's been really interesting to have American authors as well as authors that are from other countries that are translated into English. So if you get a chance and come to Malvern, we'd love to talk to you about that. But as it is, we're so pleased to be here. And